And for the rest of us, we'll be in the book of Isaiah this morning, chapter 9. We're going to look at the verses 1 through 7. We're going to begin Advent season, a message of hope. The page numbers are there in your bulletin if you're using one of the Pew Bibles to help you there. I have to watch myself that I don't say James this morning because we've been in James for several weeks and months now. But the book of Isaiah. Now, this time of year, as you may have gathered, I like seeing Christmas lights, okay? I love seeing the bright lights. I've always, even as a kid, we'd be traveling down the road and you'd look out in the field, just be dark, and all of a sudden Christmas time comes and the lights, you'd see them really far out in the distance where you didn't even realize something was, and even the kids are starting to like that as well. Christina and I will drive around, they'll walk at them, and Abby just yells shoes the whole time because that's what she's saying now. And but she likes them too, and we just go with it. But I've often wondered why we enjoy these lights so much, or why do we enjoy light so much? Why do we enjoy not things being dark? You know, when it's dark, it's hard to see anything. And even the smallest glimpse of light can make the world of difference. And in our passage this morning, we're going to look a little bit more at that kind of theme. Isaiah was an interesting guy. He's quoted often in the New Testament, but Isaiah was a prophet. Now, prophecy, I don't want to get at totally into prophecy this morning, but I will say prophets spoke what God wanted them to speak. They would only speak what God wanted them to speak. Prophecy was often one of God's way to make a promise to his people that something would happen. And it would happen. Now, we find so many prophecies and books in the Old Testament that come to pass in the New Testament. So it's not a uncommon thing to see where something has come forth from a prophet, from a prophecy that a prophet made. So in our passage this morning, that's one of those times where we see that this has actually happened. So we're putting ourselves in the history of the passage, but even though we know that Christ has come. What do we deal with this, or how do we deal with this? My opinion is that it's evidence of God's faithfulness. God is faithful to his people. And my goal this morning, by looking at Isaiah 9, that we will see that we have a promised hope this morning. In the midst of our darkness, in the midst of our darkest days, there is hope shining in the form of Jesus. So first, let's dive in. Verse 1. Hope is needed. Verse 1, but there will be no gloom for her who was in anguish. In the former time he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, but in the latter time he has made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. Now this verse is probably not very well known what's going on here. So, and I had to dive into this week. And without understanding what's happening, without understanding the background, what's happening in Israel, and especially this chapter, it doesn't make quite as much sense. So what happened is the Assyrians at this time in the world had overtaken this part of Israel, the northern tribes. And the northern tribes, what they would typically do during that time is they would separate them. Mainly so that they wouldn't rebel against the new oppressors. But it was a dark, dark situation. It was a devastating time for Israel. There was darkness in the sense that not a physical physical darkness, but a spiritual darkness. They felt far from God. Many of them felt like God had abandoned them. And it was during this time of darkness that God began to show them the light. They needed a source of hope. Darkness, physically and spiritually, hits us all at different moments in our lives. And we can relate to the Israelites here. They were in a very hard time in their lives, in their history. This was not a good period. It was a horrible, horrible times. And we can relate to that in our lives as well. We can relate to that darkness, whether it's loss of a job, whether it's loss of a family member, whether it's sickness, whether it's someone finding out they have cancer again, whether it's problems with neighbors, the list goes on. Sometimes it's almost as if there is complete darkness. And we need that glimmer. We need that glimmer of hope that comes from God. One author said this. He said, Christmas contains many spiritual truths, but it will be hard to grasp the others unless we grasp this one first. He says this, that is, that the world is a dark place, and we will never find our way or see reality unless Jesus is our light. He died on the cross. Darkness fell over the land. But the light of the world descended into darkness in order to bring us into God's beautiful light. The promise of Christmas cannot be discerned unless you first admit you can't save yourself or even know yourself without the light of His unmerited grace in your life. That's Christmas. That's why we need this hope. The hope is coming. Hope is needed in our lives. And it was needed in Israel's time, in this time in history. They were looking for that hope, something that they could cling on to. Now look at this, verses 2 through 5. Hope is sure. Hope is sure. Verses 2 through 5. The people who walked in darkness, referring to the Israelites, have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shone. You have multiplied the nation. You have increased its joy. They rejoice before you as with joy at the harvest, as they are glad when they divide the spoil. For the yoke of his burden and the staff for his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, you have broken as on the day of Midian. For every boot of the trampling warrior in battle, tumult and every garment rolled in blood will be burned as fuel for the fire. Interesting little set of verses here, but it shows us that our hope is sure. Why? Well, we'll dive into it here. God's people were walking in darkness. Again, they were devastated. It was a horrible time in their history. They needed hope. And God, again, showed His faithfulness to them. God's people saw the light. There was this glimmer of hope. And it's interesting. I didn't have to search or stretch to apply this somehow, some kind of light. It's all right here. God showed them. He gave them their hope. This light is a source of hope in the midst of Israel's darkness. Now, the light refers in the spiritual sense to God's blessings, His presence, His revelation to them. He wants them to know He's not forgotten about them. Now, again, Assyria was the major powerhouse of this day. There was nothing for them to find hope in. But God is resting. He says, look, I'm sending hope. Here's the light. Cling on to it. Don't give up. Keep going. Keep persevering. Here's what I'm going to do. And He proves this. And this is interesting. This had not hit me before. God's people multiplied under this Assyrian rule. Now, what's important about that? At first glance, nothing. But as it started hitting me, here's what's important. Back in Genesis, all right, God made a covenant with Abraham. He said, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven, and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies, and in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice. God was showing His faithfulness to His people through causing them to multiply. And because of it, the people started to find joy. They saw God's faithfulness and they began to find joy. And it says, like a person who has a harvest, a farmer who has a good harvest, he finds joy in that, right? And this is how the people were to respond to God showing His faithfulness. And ultimately, God will give them relief. That is what He is promising. God will give you relief. He uses the words, the yoke and the staff. These are figures of oppression, right? They're figures of something that's hard, laborious, something that the people would not want. God says he will send relief just like he did in Midian. Now, Midian is the story of Gideon in Judges 6 through 7. It's an interesting story. You should read it if you haven't before. God basically, against all odds, saved God's people, saved the Israelites, used Gideon to overcome his enemy. And eventually, God's people, Israel, us today, we won't have to worry about war again. We won't have to worry about being oppressed, being persecuted. Even as I'm sure you saw the story about the person who was shot on that Indian tribe. We don't have to worry about that one day. Wars will cease. And verse 5 has an interesting imagery. If you look back at it, it's not a popular verse, but it's interesting what it points to. The words he uses, every boot of the trampling warrior, every garment rolled in blood, will be burned as fuel for the fire. These are images of victory. They signify victory, as was common in that day. They would destroy all those things that were left over from the battle, from the enemy they had. God will reign supreme one day. Psalm 46, 9 through 10. He says, he makes wars cease to the end of the earth. He breaks the bow and shatters the spear. He burns the chariots with fire. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The things of war will no longer be needed when God's kingdom ultimately reigns. This is the hope he was giving the people then, and it's hope for us today. We can rest assured that the same God who promised these things to them is the same God we serve today. We have hope that this is not it. This is not the end. The things we are going through today is not all there is. There will be a future reign with Christ. He is giving us a promise, this glimmer of light, he says. Isaiah says it's a glimmer of light for the people. He wants to give them that little thing of hope that they can rest on. Everyone, I read this week, everyone, sooner or later, knows the pain of injustice. And of course, we ourselves are often guilty of treating others unfairly as well. The unfairness of so much of life in this fallen world quickly generates cynicism, discouragement. Why try to do good? Why try to change those things? This author says. He says, why bother to make a difference when injustice and inequality are so rampant? He says this, the promise of Isaiah 9 has already dawned in the world in the middle of history. This is why it's more than a warm inspirational thought for Christmas. This passage, the verses we're going to look at here in just a minute, is our lifeline. It's our sanity. It's our reason for why we keep moving on. He says God gave his Son, the Prince of Peace, to be treated unjustly so that we who trust in him can be guaranteed that one day every injustice against us will be rewound and straightened out. It's a peace, a justice of which there is no end. You catch this as we transition to verses 6 and 7. Our hope is needed. We need hope. Our hope is sure it will happen. God is faithful. But our hope ultimately rests in a baby. Our hope ultimately rests in a baby. Verses 6 through 7, Olivia read this earlier. It's, for to us a child is born. To us a son is given. And the government shall be upon his shoulder. And his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end. And on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. The hope of God's people and the hope of God's people then and the hope of God's people now rests its case on these words, "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given." Now this text should be understood that the child that is being referred to, and we know it's Jesus, but at the time there may have been confusion. It rests in his characteristics. We read this based off who it is talking about, these characteristics that are listed. It says, "The government shall be upon his shoulder. All authority will be given to Christ ultimately. He will reign." It frees us. We won't be in charge. We won't have to worry about self-rule or horrible governments, things that are awful today. Jesus will rule forever, and we will serve him. There's hope involved in that. And here are the characteristics he gives. Here are the qualities of the one who will reign supreme. First, he is the wonderful counselor. This refers to someone who makes wise and perfect plans. Jesus will and is the wonderful counselor who frees us from the foolish decisions we make. He will be the wonderful counselor. He will make the perfect decisions. The second one is mighty God. God protects his people as the Almighty One. He cares for and will and has as Jesus came. This is why this is so important. Jesus defeated death and sin. This is why he is the Almighty God and who we serve. He is the everlasting Father. It's shepherd imagery here. He cares for us. His love does not end for his own. If one starts to wander, he brings them back. You cannot ultimately run from God. He cares and loves his own. And then it says the Prince of Peace. God brings wholeness and peace to his people. Our future government, God's government, will bring peace. In Luke 2:14, "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace among those with whom he is pleased." Jesus brings peace to his own. You may find peace in him. Under the lordship and reign of Christ, God's people will find ultimate peace and security in God's kingdom. Now, he says some things about the Lord. He says Jesus was a descendant of David. This made sense to the Israelites at this time. And it's a promise of who he is and the line he has come. And it even refers back to Abraham. Now, this line of kingly authority that Jesus has. And then it says the zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. Now, what does that mean? Well, it's simply a promise that would often be used in prophecy that this will happen. This is sure. There's no chance of it not happening. The zeal of the Lord will do this. And ultimately, we see this in a familiar passage, John 3:16 and 17. Some of you can quote this. I'll read it for us. "For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him." Now, most of us know this passage, and it's a familiar one. Now, this passage is not saying everyone will be Christians, right? Not everyone will be saved one day. However, what it does say, and if you read it in its context, it does say that there will be people from every nation, tribe, and tongue. People of all kinds. Tall, short, big, small, whatever. People with big feet, people with small feet. However you want to view that. There will be all types of people who God sent his Son to save. This is the gospel message for us all. And it is the hope and the light that as we begin this Advent season, I hope that we cling to. That we see that hope remains and rests in Jesus. And you might experience that hope too. Let us pray. Father, thank you this morning that our hope rests in you and you alone. There's things that we try to put our hope in. There's things that we look at for comfort, but nothing is steady. Nothing is faithful like you are. You remain faithful. you remain steady in our lives. We can trust you. And just like the Israelites were promised this hope, this glimmering of light, this little spark, Lord, we look to that same hope today. No matter what we're going through, no matter how hard it is, we look to the hope of Christ this Christmas season. And I pray that we will not keep that to ourselves, but we will share that hope with others. In your name we pray. Amen.